Okay, I want you to imagine something for a second. An earthquake, but it's so slow you can't even feel the tremors. Yet, it's powerful enough to completely reshape the very foundations of our society. Well, that's the core idea we're going to dive into today. It comes from an article that calls the huge demographic shifts happening in the USA and Europe a silent earthquake, a force that, has the power to change, well, pretty much everything.
So, that brings us to the big question that this whole article is built around. Are we actually ignoring this silent earthquake that's rumbling right under our feet? It's really asking us to look past the day-to-day news cycle, and think about these massive, deep changes happening just beneath the surface. The real question is, are we paying attention?
All right, so what is this silent earthquake anyway? Well, it's a metaphor, right? The source uses it to talk about the incredible, almost unstoppable power of demographic change. And to really get a handle on its impact, the article lays out a really clear framework for us, which is what we're going to break down piece by piece. Okay, so first things first. Let's get a clear definition. When we talk about demographic shifts, what do we actually mean? The source says it's basically driven by three key things. Migration, so people moving across borders. Different birth rates among various groups, and internal movements, people moving around inside a country. These are the tremors, so to speak, that make up the earthquake.
Right. Now, the article makes a really important point here. These tremors, they don't just happen randomly. They systematically shake what it calls the three core pillars of a society. And what are they? It's all about who holds the political power, who's in control of the economy, and what actually defines a nation's cultural identity. Let's start with that first one, the political pillar.
So, let's kick things off with that first pillar, political power. The source material draws a really direct line between these demographic shifts and what happens in politics. The argument is pretty straightforward. As a country's population changes, its entire electoral landscape can get completely redrawn.
And what's fascinating is how this political impact plays out differently on either side of the Atlantic. In the US, the article points to things like the redrawing of electoral maps, the huge influence on swing states, and that growing power gap between cities and rural areas. But in Europe, the focus is a little different. It's more about how local and national voting patterns are changing, which sometimes fuels populist parties and kicks off these really intense debates about what citizenship even means.
And this is where we get the source's first big warning. It's a critical one. The argument goes like this. When any large group of people, doesn't matter if they're newcomers or have been there for generations, feels like they're not being heard, their faith in the whole democratic process can start to crumble. And that can lead to some serious instability.
Okay, so moving on from politics, the second pillar this earthquake shakes is the economy. And the argument here is that these shifts don't just change who votes, they also change who owns the businesses, who's doing the work, and, who ultimately reaps the benefits of a country's wealth.
And again, we see different economic pressure points. In the USA, a lot of the debate is centered on the labor market, competition for jobs, and who's really getting ahead from economic growth. Over in Europe, the article says the conversation is often more about the strain on public services. Think housing, healthcare, the welfare system, especially as migrant populations come in to fill really crucial gaps in the economy. And this leads us to the second major warning from the source. It says that if the economic side of things, integrating new groups, isn't managed well, it can create these really deep divides along class and ethnic lines. The article cautions this is a recipe for resentment and social unrest, especially when people start to feel like the economic game is rigged.
Which brings us to the third pillar. And this one, as the source itself notes, might be the most sensitive of all: cultural identity. We're talking about the very soul of a nation here, right? How a country sees itself, what it believes it stands for.
And just like before, we see sort of two different versions of the same core challenge. In the US, the article frames it as that classic debate. Are we a melting pot where everyone blends together, or more of a mosaic with distinct pieces? But in Europe, it's a bit different. There, you have nations with these really long, historically homogenous identities that are now grappling with supercharged debates over things like religious symbols, history, and what it even means to be French or German or Swedish in the 21st century.
And that brings us to the final and maybe the most powerful warning in the whole piece. The source argues that when a large number of people feel that their fundamental cultural identity is being threatened or lost, that feeling can be an incredibly potent fuel for division. It can lead to society breaking into fragments and, a rise in nativism. So to really drive these warnings home, the source doesn't just stick to the present day. It actually looks back at history, pointing to some major past events as sort of cautionary tales of what can happen when these kinds of demographic shifts are not only rapid, but also filled with conflict. And it points to two really stark examples. First up, the 1947 partition of India. I mean, this was a profoundly violent event that led to one of the biggest and fastest demographic upheavals we've ever seen. And then, more recently, the forced displacement of the Kashmiri Pandits from the Kashmir Valley in the 1990s. The article argues that this exodus essentially wiped out the region's long history of cultural pluralism.
So what's the connection between these two events? Well, this is where it ties back to that economic pillar we talked about. In both the partition and in Kashmir, the source highlights that the upheaval wasn't just about people being forced to move. It was also about a massive and often violent transfer of wealth, shops, homes, land, you name it, from one group to another.
Okay, so after laying out the three pillars, political, economic, and cultural, and backing them up with these historical warnings, the article brings it all together for its conclusion. It's what the source calls the hardcore truth of the whole situation. And that final argument really boils down to three main takeaways. First, demography is this incredibly powerful, almost unseen force that is basically shaping our destiny, yet we barely talk about it. Second, it's really dangerous to just dismiss these conversations as propaganda or noise. And finally, and this is a big one, even the most stable democracies on Earth aren't immune to these pressures. The bottom line from the source? Ignoring this is simply not an option. And so, that leaves us with a final, really profound question. This silent earthquake, it's happening. According to the source material, the real test for all of our societies isn't about whether we can stop it, because we probably can't. It's about how we choose to deal with it. Are we just going to let the ground crack open beneath our feet? Or are we going to try and build something new, something more resilient, on top of these shifting foundations? It's something to think about.